I'm Marcus Kane, 47 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I was untouchable with my $85 million empire built from tech acquisitions and real estate investments. For 2 years, I trusted David Chen, my head of security, the man who knew every detail of my business operations, my personal routines, even my family's schedules. The same man who sat across from my kitchen table every morning, drinking coffee and discussing security protocols. But last Tuesday, when federal agents stormed my Manhattan penthouse at dawn, David was leading the charge with an FBI badge gleaming on his chest. 2 years of friendship, 2 years of trust, all a carefully orchestrated lie to build a case that could destroy everything I've worked for. The betrayal cut deeper than any business loss I'd ever faced, and what happened next would test every survival instinct I had. Like and subscribe if you've ever discovered someone you trusted was playing a completely different game. The sound that woke me wasn't my usual 6 a.m. alarm. It was the thunderous crash of my penthouse door being ripped from its hinges. Before my mind could process what was happening, my bedroom filled with tactical gear-clad figures shouting commands. I couldn't understand through the fog of sleep and shock. "Marcus Kane, you're under arrest." The voice cut through the chaos like a blade. I sat up in bed, squinting against the harsh beam of flashlights, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding in my sanctuary 50 floors above Manhattan. That's when I saw him. David Chen, my head of security for the past 2 years, standing in my bedroom doorway. But instead of rushing to protect me, as he'd done countless times during security drills, he wore an FBI windbreaker and held a badge that caught the morning light streaming through my floor-to-ceiling windows. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. David, the man who'd shared coffee with me every morning, who knew my daughter's school schedule, who'd been present at my most private family moments, was leading this invasion of my life. David, my voice came out as barely a whisper. The name felt foreign on my tongue, as if speaking it might make this surreal moment even more real. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "Special Agent David Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division," he announced to the room, his voice professionally detached. Gone was the warm tone he'd used when discussing weekend plans or joking about my terrible golf swing. The agents were methodical, almost surgical in their efficiency. They had search warrants for everything: my computers, my phones, my financial records, even my wife's jewelry box. Every drawer was pulled open, every document photographed, every electronic device bagged as evidence. Sarah stood in the hallway, clutching her robe, tears streaming down her face. Emma, my 17-year-old daughter, peered out from her bedroom door, eyes wide with terror and confusion. This was supposed to be their safe space, our family fortress high above the city's chaos. "You have the right to remain silent," the arresting agent began, but his words faded into background noise as I stared at David. 2 years of friendship, 2 years of trust, dissolved in an instant. Every conversation we'd had, every confidence I'd shared, every family dinner he'd attended, all of it had been performance. Calculated deception designed to gather evidence against me. I thought back to the day I'd hired him. His credentials had been impeccable. Former military, private, security experience, glowing references from clients I'd personally contacted. He'd impressed me with his thoroughness, his attention to detail, his genuine concern for my family's safety. Or what I'd believed was genuine concern. Now, I understood why he'd always asked such thoughtful questions about my business dealings. Why he'd volunteered to review financial documents for security purposes. Why he'd insisted on being present during sensitive phone calls to ensure no one was listening in. He'd been listening in for the FBI. The handcuffs were cold against my wrists as they led me through my own home. Past family photos that now felt like evidence of a life that might be ending. David walked behind us, no longer my protector but my captor, carrying files that I realized now contained detailed reports about every aspect of my existence. As we reached the elevator, I finally found my voice. "How long?" I asked, turning to face him. David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. 2 years, he said quietly, the first crack in his professional facade. 2 years, 730 days of deception. I trusted this man with my life, with my family's lives, and every single day had been a lie carefully constructed to destroy me. Sitting in that federal holding cell, I had nothing but time to think about how far I'd command, how far I was about to fall. My empire hadn't been built overnight, and it certainly hadn't been built through the criminal activities the FBI seemed convinced I was guilty of. I grew up in Queens, the son of a mechanic and a school secretary. My father, Frank Kane, worked 16-hour days keeping other people's cars running while dreaming of owning his own shop. My mother, Linda, graded papers at our kitchen table every night, fighting to give kids in underfunded schools the education they deserved. They taught me that success came through hard work, not shortcuts. The first contract that changed everything was still framed in my office, assuming the FBI hadn't seized it as evidence. DataSync Solutions, a small software company struggling with inventory management, had agreed to pay me $50,000 to build them a custom tracking system. It was 2008, I was 29 years old, and $50,000 might as well have been $50 million. I'd been freelancing for 3 years, living in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, surviving on ramen noodles and the occasional consulting gig, computer science degree from SUNY, but no connections, no family money, no safety net except my own determination. While my college friends were climbing corporate ladders at established firms, I was betting everything on my ability to solve problems others COULDN. Single quotes T. The data sync project consumed for months of my life. I worked 18-hour days, teaching myself new programming languages, debugging code until my eyes burned. The system I delivered didn't just meet their requirements, it revolutionized how they operated. Within 6 months, their efficiency had improved by 40%, and word spread through their industry network. That success led to 3 more contracts before 2009 ended, then 5 more in 2010. By 2012, I wasn't just building software, I was acquiring the small companies I had helped optimize. DataSync became my first acquisition for $200,000, funded by a loan secured against the very software system I'd built for them. The tech boom of the 2010s was perfect timing for someone with my skills and growing reputation. While others chased the next social media platform or gaming app, I focused on the unsexy but profitable world of business optimization software. Companies were desperate to streamline operations, reduce costs, increase efficiency. One provided solutions, then gradually acquired the companies that implemented them successfully. By 2015, my portfolio included 12 companies across logistics, inventory management, and data analytics. Each acquisition was carefully planned, thoroughly vetted, and legitimately financed. I wasn't some wolf of Wall Street playing fast and loose with other people's money. I was building sustainable businesses that provided real value. The real estate investments came later, starting with converting the Brooklyn warehouse where I'd established my first real office. The neighborhood was transitioning, property values were rising, and I saw opportunity where others saw only old industrial buildings. I renovated 3 properties, sold 2 at substantial profits, and kept 1 as my expanding headquarters. Sarah entered my life during this period. She was an interior designer working on one of my renovated properties, and I was immediately struck by her intelligence and creativity. She saw potential in spaces the way I saw potential in businesses. Our first date lasted 8 hours. Coffee, walking through Brooklyn neighborhoods while she pointed out architectural details. I'd never noticed that. We married in 2014, and Emma was born the following year. Success felt complete when I could provide my family with everything my parents had struggled to give me. The Manhattan penthouse wasn't just a status symbol. It was proof that the American dream still worked for people willing to work for it. By 2020, my net worth had reached $25 million. The pandemic actually accelerated growth as businesses desperately needed the efficiency solutions my companies provided. Remote work, supply chain disruptions, digital transformation, every challenge created opportunities for the software and systems my portfolio companies developed. The jump from $25 million to $85 million happened over 3 years. Through a combination of strategic acquisitions, real estate appreciation, and smart investments in emerging technologies. Every dollar was earned legally, every transaction documented, every tax obligation met. So I thought. Apparently the FBI saw something else entirely in my success story. David Chen walked into my life on a Tuesday in March 2022, carrying credentials that seemed too good to be true. In hindsight, that should have been my first red flag. I'd been in the market for a head of security for months. Success brings attention, and not all of it welcome. My growing profile in the tech acquisition space had attracted some unwanted interest, persistent reporters, overeager business partners, and the occasional person who seemed to think my wealth meant I owed them something. Sarah had started noticing cars parked too long outside Emma's school, and I'd received a few messages that made me uncomfortable. The executive security firm I'd contacted sent 3 candidates. David was the third, and from the moment he walked into my office, he commanded attention. Former Army intelligence, they said. 10 years in private security protecting high-net-worth individuals and their families. Spotless record, glowing references, and an almost encyclopedic knowledge of modern security threats. Mr. Kane, he'd said, shaking my hand with the perfect balance of firmness and respect. I've researched your situation, and I believe there are several vulnerabilities in your current security posture that need immediate attention. He'd done his homework. David knew about the reporter who'd been trying to get photos of our family, the business competitor who'd made veiled threats during a failed acquisition negotiation, even the disgruntled former employee who'd been posting angry messages about me on social media. His assessment was thorough, professional, and exactly what I needed to hear. His references checked out perfectly. James Morrison, a hedge fund manager in Connecticut, praised David's discretion and effectiveness. He protected my family during some very difficult business circumstances, Morrison had told me over the phone. Couldn't recommend him more highly. 2 other clients gave similar glowing reviews. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that James Morrison was also under FBI investigation, and his glowing recommendation was part of David's carefully constructed cover story. David's first week was impressive. He conducted a comprehensive security audit of our penthouse, identified weaknesses in our digital privacy, and implemented protocols that made me feel genuinely safer. He suggested new routes to Emma's school, recommended encrypted communication apps for sensitive business calls, and even spotted a photographer trying to get pictures of Sarah during her morning run. More importantly, he fit seamlessly into our lives. David wasn't just a bodyguard lurking in the shadows. He became part of our daily routine. He'd arrive every morning at 7, share coffee while reviewing the day's schedule, and often stayed for dinner when his duties required late night protection. Emma loved hearing his stories about traveling to different countries for security work. Sarah appreciated his thoughtful suggestions about home safety that didn't make our penthouse feel like a fortress. "He's not like other security people," Sarah had said after David's first month. "He actually cares about our family, not just the paycheck." That caring attention was exactly what made his betrayal so devastating. David remembered birthdays, asked about Emma's soccer games, inquired about Sarah's design projects. He knew I took my coffee black, preferred morning meetings, and got anxious when business deals dragged on too long. He knew Emma was struggling with calculus, and Sarah worried about her mother's health issues. Every personal detail I shared, every vulnerability I revealed, every moment of trust I extended was carefully cataloged and reported back to the FBI. The man I'd welcomed into my family's most private moments was building a case designed to destroy us. David had master keys to our penthouse, access codes to my office building, and detailed knowledge of my business operations. I'd even given him power of attorney for certain security-related decisions, allowing him to make changes to our protection systems without consulting me first. Looking back, I should have questioned why someone with his impressive credentials wanted to work for someone like me. I wasn't a Fortune 500 CEO or a celebrity requiring round-the-clock protection, but David had an answer for that too. He preferred working with entrepreneurs because the security challenges were more varied and interesting than protecting traditional corporate executives. It was a perfect cover story for someone whose real job was gathering intelligence on my business dealings, my personal relationships, and my daily routines. Every question David asked, every suggestion he made, every concern he raised was designed to give him deeper access to information the FBI needed to build their case. The most painful part wasn't just the professional betrayal, it was the personal one. I'd genuinely liked David. We'd bonded over shared interests in technology and travel. He'd become not just an employee, but a friend I trusted with my family's safety. That trust was now evidence in a federal case against me. Sitting in my lawyer's office 3 days after the arrest, reviewing 2 years of memories with new eyes, the red flags seemed blindingly obvious. How had I been so naive? How had I missed so many signs that David Chen was playing a completely different game? My attorney, Rebecca Martinez, spread David's reports across her conference table like a detective laying out evidence. "Your security chief was remarkably thorough," she said dryly, almost like he was building a file instead of providing protection. The first red flag should have been David's unusual interest in my financial operations. Most security professionals focus on physical threats, digital vulnerabilities, travel safety. David consistently steered conversations toward business dealings that had nothing to do with security. "Who are you meeting with next week?" he'd ask while reviewing my calendar. When I'd mention a potential acquisition target, David would probe deeper. "What's their financial situation? Any regulatory issues? Competitors who might not want this deal to succeed?" At the time, I'd interpreted his questions as thorough security planning. Now I understood he was gathering intelligence about my business network. The encrypted hard drive incident should have been a massive warning. Last October, David had urgently recommended upgrading my data security after claiming he'd detected suspicious network activity. "I need to copy your files to a secure server," he'd explained, "just as a backup while we implement new encryption protocols." I'd given him access to everything: financial records, business communications, personal documents. David spent an entire weekend securing my data, working late into the night at my home office. I'd even brought him coffee and thanked him for his dedication. In reality, he was copying years of sensitive information to build the FBI's case against me. Then there were the meetings. David had an uncanny ability to be present during sensitive business conversations. "I should monitor this call for security purposes," he'd suggest when I was negotiating acquisitions. "You never know who might be listening in." The irony was devastating. I'd welcomed FBI surveillance into my most confidential dealings because I thought David was protecting me from exactly that kind of intrusion. His questions about my associates were another obvious red flag I'd completely missed. During our morning coffee routine, David would casually ask about people in my business network. "Tell me about Tony Salvatore. Is he someone who might attract unwanted attention? Or that banker you're working with, Patricia Wells, does she handle other high-profile clients?" I'd answered every question, providing David with detailed profiles of my business relationships, personal friendships, and professional network. I'd thought I was helping him assess potential security risks. Instead, I was mapping my entire social and business ecosystem for federal investigators. The travel coordination should have raised suspicions. David insisted on detailed itineraries. For business trips, complete with meeting locations, attendee lists, and discussion topics. I need to understand your exposure in different cities, he'd explained. Some business districts have higher crime rates, certain hotels have better security protocols. His recommendations often seemed excessive. He'd suggest changing meeting locations at the last minute, claiming he'd identified security concerns with the original venue. He'd recommend specific restaurants for business dinners, always places with better sightlines and exit strategies. I now realized he was probably directing me toward locations that were easier for FBI surveillance teams to monitor. The most painful red flag was David's relationship with my family. He'd cultivated genuine friendships with Sarah and Emma, attending school events, family dinners, even Emma's soccer games. At the time, his personal investment in our lives felt like dedication to his job. Now I understood it was professional manipulation designed to maintain his cover and gather more personal intelligence. Sarah had confided in David about her concerns regarding my long work hours and business stress. Emma had shared typical teenage problems and college application anxieties. David knew our family dynamics better than some of our actual relatives, and he'd used that knowledge to stay embedded in our lives while building a case against me. The surveillance equipment upgrades were perhaps the most obvious signs I'd missed. David had gradually replaced our home security system with more sophisticated cameras and monitoring devices. Technology is advancing rapidly, he'd explained. These new systems provide much better coverage and data storage. I'd been proud of our state-of-the-art security system, not realizing that David had essentially wired our home for FBI surveillance. Every conversation, every family moment, every private discussion had potentially been recorded and analyzed by federal investigators. Looking back, my instincts had occasionally whispered warnings. There were moments when David's questions seemed oddly specific, times when his interest in particular business details felt excessive, but I'd dismissed those doubts, convincing myself that thoroughness was exactly what I wanted in a security professional. The encrypted hard drive now sat in FBI evidence storage, containing 2 years of my most sensitive information, all freely provided because I'd trusted the wrong person. Every red flag I'd missed had contributed to building the case that might destroy everything I'd worked to create. The private dinner photos were what broke me. Rebecca spread them across her desk like a hand of cards revealing a losing game. Photo after photo of David at our most intimate family gatherings, business dinners, private celebrations, except these weren't family memories. They were surveillance documentation. David hadn't just infiltrated my professional life. He'd embedded himself so deeply in our personal world that my family had started considering him part of it. Looking at these images now, I could see him in every important moment of the past 2 years, positioned perfectly to observe and record. There was David at Emma's 17th birthday party, helping her blow out candles while secretly documenting every guest who attended. Sarah's parents had flown in from California. My business partner Tony Salvatore had brought his wife, and several other associates had joined our celebration. What I'd seen as a security professional ensuring my daughter's safety, the FBI had seen as intelligence gathering about my personal network. He photographed everyone, Rebecca noted, pointing to close-ups of individual guests. Names, faces, conversations. Your daughter's birthday party became a federal intelligence operation. The Thanksgiving dinner photos were particularly devastating. David had volunteered to help Sarah coordinate the event, suggesting the guest lists, even helping with seating arrangements. I'd thought he was being thoughtful, ensuring our family gathering remained secure and private. In reality, he was orchestrating optimal surveillance positions and documenting every attendee's interactions with me. My brother Michael had brought his new girlfriend. My longtime accountant Patricia Wells had joined us with her husband, Tony. Salvatore's entire family had been there, including his college-aged son, who'd been thinking about applying for internships at my companies. David had captured every conversation, every relationship dynamic, every piece of personal information shared around our dining table. The business dinner surveillance was even more sophisticated. David had accompanied me to dozens of professional meals over 2 years, ostensibly to ensure my safety in public venues. The photos revealed his true purpose, documenting every business relationship, every deal discussion, every potential partnership conversation. There was David at the steakhouse where I'd first met with the founders of Cloud Vault Technologies, the company I'd eventually acquire for $12 million. He'd recommended that particular restaurant, claiming it had excellent security sightlines. Now I understood he'd chosen it because FBI surveillance teams could easily monitor our conversation from multiple angles. The photos from my regular monthly dinner with my investment banker, Patricia Wells, were particularly detailed. David had insisted on being present during these meetings, arguing that financial discussions made me a target for corporate espionage. He positioned himself to overhear every detail about my portfolio management, acquisition strategies, and investment decisions. Even more painful were the images from purely social events. David at the charity gala where I'd pledged $100,000 to the local children's hospital. David at the gallery opening where Sarah was showcasing her interior design work. David at Emma's school events, soccer games, and graduation ceremony. He'd attended Emma's college interviews as part of her security detail, documenting which schools she was considering, what her academic interests were, even her concerns about student loan debt despite our family's wealth. I'd thought he was providing reassurance during a stressful time. He was actually gathering intelligence about my family's future, plans, and financial priorities. The yacht club membership photos revealed how thoroughly David had penetrated my social circle. I'd sponsored his membership application, introducing him as my security director to other members. Within months, he was attending club events independently, building relationships with other wealthy families, gathering information about their business dealings and personal lives. "Look at this," Rebecca said, sliding over a photo from a weekend sailing trip. "He's not watching for threats. He's watching you." In the image, David wasn't scanning for security risks or monitoring our surroundings. His attention was focused entirely on me as I discussed a potential real estate investment with another club member. The private office meetings were the most damaging. David had been present during sensitive negotiations, confidential strategy sessions, and private consultations with legal and financial advisors. I'd welcomed his presence, believing his military intelligence background provided valuable perspective on business security. Instead, he'd been recording detailed notes about every aspect of my operations. Sarah's book club meetings had been infiltrated. David had volunteered to provide security during evening gatherings at our penthouse, claiming that regular social events created predictable vulnerabilities. The photos showed him positioned to overhear conversations between Sarah and the wives of other prominent businessmen, gathering personal information about their families, their husbands, businesses, their social connections. Even our family vacations hadn't been safe. David had accompanied us to the Hamptons, to Aspen, to our weekend retreat in Connecticut. Every destination, every activity, every person we encountered had been documented. Our private family moments had become federal evidence. The most devastating photo was from last Christmas morning. Emma was opening presents while Sarah and I watched from the couch, coffee cups in hand. Still in our pajamas, David stood in the background, supposedly checking security systems. But the camera had captured him photographing our gift exchange, our family traditions, our most intimate holiday moments. Looking at these surveillance photos, I realized that, for 2 years, we'd had no privacy, no genuine family time, no unmonitored personal relationships. Every conversation, every celebration, every quiet moment had been observed, recorded, and analyzed by federal investigators. David hadn't just betrayed my trust, he'd violated my family's sanctuary and turned our most precious memories into evidence for a case designed to destroy us. The FBI case file cover sheet that Rebecca obtained through Discovery was a masterpiece of bureaucratic precision. Operation Golden Gate. It read, with David's real name listed as the primary undercover operative. The timeline revealed a level of planning and coordination that made my stomach turn. The investigation had begun 18 months before David ever walked into my office. Someone had flagged my rapid business growth and real estate acquisitions as potentially suspicious. The initial trigger, according to the file, was my acquisition of 3 companies within 6 months in 2021, combined with several large real estate purchases that seemed inconsistent with reported income sources. What the FBI apparently didn't understand, or chose not to understand, was that successful entrepreneurs often experience explosive growth periods. My business model was based on acquiring underperforming companies, optimizing their operations, and either selling them at a profit or integrating them into my larger portfolio. The real estate investments were strategic diversification, not money laundering schemes. Phase 1 of their investigation had lasted 8 months. From January 2021 through September 2021, during this period, they'd conducted financial surveillance, monitoring my bank accounts, credit card transactions, and business dealings from a distance. They'd interviewed former employees, business partners, and even neighbors, all under the guise of routine background checks for various purposes. The file contained summaries of these interviews, and reading them was like discovering that my entire life had been under a microscope. Mrs. Patterson from the apartment next to my old Brooklyn office had told investigators about my unusual work hours and frequent visitors. My former assistant Jennifer had provided detailed information about my business practices, client relationships, and financial habits. Phase 2 was where David entered the picture. The FBI had identified that they needed someone inside my operation to gather evidence about my day-to-day business activities. They'd spent 3 months creating David's cover identity, complete with fabricated military records, fake client references, and a carefully constructed professional history. James Morrison, The hedge fund manager, who'd provided such a glowing recommendation, was revealed to be a cooperating witness in his own federal investigation. His enthusiastic endorsement of David's services had been part of a plea agreement to reduce his own charges. The other references had been similarly compromised, creating an echo chamber of fake credibility that I'd never thought to question. Sophistication of David's insertion into my life was stunning. The FBI had researched my business needs, identified my growing security concerns, and even monitored my communications with executive protection firms to understand exactly what kind of candidate would appeal to me. David's credentials, personality, and approach had been specifically tailored to what I was looking for. Phase 3 began with David's hiring in March 2022. The file documented a systematic intelligence gathering operation that went far beyond anything I'd imagined. David filed reports every 48 hours, submitted weekly comprehensive summaries, and provided monthly strategic assessments of my business operations and personal relationships. The wiretaps had started within 2 weeks of David's employment. Using his access to my home and office security systems, FBI technicians had installed sophisticated listening devices throughout my properties. My phones were monitored, my computers were compromised, and even my vehicles had been equipped with tracking and recording equipment. But the most invasive surveillance was the human intelligence David provided. Every conversation we'd had, every business meeting he'd attended, every family interaction he'd witnessed had been documented in meticulous detail. The FBI knew what I ate for breakfast, how often Sarah and I argued, what Emma worried about regarding college applications, and which business deals kept me awake at night. The timeline showed that by October 2022, the FBI believed they had enough evidence to support charges. However, they'd decided to continue the operation for another year, to build a more comprehensive case and identify other potentially criminal associates in my network. Reading between the lines, I realized that the investigation had expanded far beyond me. Tony Salvatore, my business partner, was now under scrutiny. Patricia Wells, my investment banker, had been flagged for additional investigation. Several other associates who'd attended our family gatherings or business meetings were now subjects of federal interest. The final phase of the operation had focused on documenting my most recent business activities. My acquisition of Cloud Vault Technologies had been monitored in real time, with David providing daily updates about negotiation strategies, financial terms, and integration plans. The FBI had even obtained copies of confidential contracts and proprietary business information through David's access. The case file revealed that the morning of my arrest had been planned for weeks. The timing wasn't random, it coincided with the completion of several major business deals that the FBI wanted to include in their charges. They'd waited until they had documentation of what they considered a complete pattern of suspicious activity. Most devastating was the realization that the investigation was still ongoing. My arrest hadn't ended Operation Golden Gate. It had simply moved into a new phase. The FBI was now using everything David had gathered to investigate my business associates, family members, and anyone else who'd been documented in their surveillance. Operation. 2 years of my life had been a performance, and I'd been the only one who didn't know I was playing a role. Every day I'd trusted David with my family's safety. He'd been building a case designed to destroy everything I'd worked to create. The investigation timeline revealed the depth of federal commitment to proving I was guilty of something, even if they weren't entirely sure what that something was. When they'd started watching me, the frozen bank account notice arrived on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after my arrest. Sarah found it in our mail pile, her hands shaking as she read the federal seizure order that had essentially made our family financially powerless overnight. "They've frozen everything," she said, her voice hollow as she sat at our kitchen table, same table where David had shared coffee with us every morning. The checking accounts, savings, even Emma's college fund. The immediate practical impact was devastating. Our credit cards stopped working. The automatic payments for our mortgage, utilities, and Emma's school tuition bounced. Sarah couldn't access the household account she used for groceries, and Emma's debit card was declined when she tried to buy lunch at school. But the financial inconvenience was nothing compared to the social devastation. Within days of the arrest becoming public, our entire social world began collapsing. Friends who'd known us for years suddenly became unavailable for dinner plans. Business associates who'd eagerly sought my partnership now wouldn't return phone calls. Emma bore the brunt of the social damage. At 17, she was old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, but still young enough to be devastated by her classmates' reactions. Kids she'd known since elementary school were suddenly whispering about her in hallways, and several parents had specifically instructed their children to avoid association with our family. "Jesse's mom said she can't hang out with me anymore," Emma told Sarah through tears one evening. "She said her family can't be associated with criminal elements right now." Jesse had been Emma's best friend since middle school, and they'd been planning to attend college together. The media attention made everything worse. Someone had leaked details about my arrest to the financial press, and within days, reporters were camped outside Emma's school, outside Sarah's design studio, even outside the grocery store we frequented. Our family's privacy, already violated by 2 years of FBI surveillance, was now completely gone. Sarah's interior design business suffered immediate damage. 3 major clients canceled projects within the first week, citing reputational concerns and the need to distance themselves from ongoing legal issues. One client had the audacity to demand Sarah return the deposit for work she'd already completed, claiming her arrest association voided their contract. The psychological impact on Sarah was heartbreaking to witness. She'd always been the strong one in our family, the steady presence who kept everyone grounded during stressful business periods, but David's betrayal had shattered her sense of security in ways that went beyond financial or legal concerns. "I keep thinking about all the times he was here," she confided during one of my supervised phone calls from jail. "All the family dinners, the conversations about Emma's future, the times I talked to him about our marriage, our dreams. He knew everything about us. Marcus, everything. And it was all a lie." Emma's college application process became another casualty. She'd been accepted to several prestigious universities, but now she worried about how my legal troubles might affect her enrollment, her financial aid, eligibility, even her social acceptance on campus. The daughter who'd once proudly talked about her father's business success now felt ashamed to mention her family background. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest consequence. Friends we'd known for decades began treating us like we had a contagious disease. Invitations to social events stopped coming. People who'd regularly attended our gatherings now crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Tony Salvatore, my business partner for 8 years, was forced to distance himself publicly from me and our joint ventures. His lawyers advised him that continued association could make him a target of the same investigation. Projects we'd planned together were indefinitely postponed, and deals we'd negotiated were falling apart. The yacht club membership that had taken years to obtain was quietly suspended pending resolution of legal matters. The charity organizations where I'd served on boards asked me to step down temporarily to avoid negative publicity. Even Emma's soccer team parents created an atmosphere so uncomfortable that she eventually quit the team she'd played on for years. Our housekeeper, Maria, who'd worked for our family for 3 years, gave notice because her immigration lawyer advised her that association with someone under federal investigation could jeopardize her citizenship application. Losing Maria felt like losing another family member, and Emma cried for hours when she realized even the people who cared about us couldn't risk staying. The frozen assets created a cascade of practical problems. We couldn't pay for the legal representation I desperately needed. Sarah had to borrow money from her parents to cover basic living expenses. Emma's private school tuition went unpaid, creating awkward conversations with administrators who'd once courted our family's donations. Most painful was watching Emma's dreams shrink. The girl who'd planned to study abroad, join prestigious university clubs, and pursue graduate school was now calculating how to afford state college tuition and wondering if she'd need to work part-time jobs to support herself. The federal seizure notice had turned us from a wealthy family into people struggling to pay for groceries. All because I'd trusted the wrong person with access to our lives. David's betrayal hadn't just threatened my freedom, it had stolen my family's security, their social connections, and their faith in the future we'd built together. Rebecca Martinez's law office occupied the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, with floor 2 sling windows that normally would have impressed me. But sitting across from her massive mahogany desk, reviewing the federal indictment that could destroy my life, even the stunning city view couldn't distract me from the gravity of my situation. 16 charges, Rebecca said, spreading the documents between us like a surgeon laying out instruments. They're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. The lead charges were money laundering and tax evasion, stemming from what the government claimed were suspicious patterns in my business acquisitions and real estate investments. According to their theory, I'd been using legitimate businesses to wash proceeds from unspecified criminal activities. The problem, Rebecca explained, is that rapid business growth can look suspicious to investigators who don't understand entrepreneurship. Your success timeline is actually evidence of good business instincts, but they're interpreting it as evidence of hidden income sources. The conspiracy charges were even more troubling. The FBI alleged that I'd been operating a criminal enterprise involving multiple associates, including Tony, Salvatore, Patricia Wells, and several other business partners. David's intelligence gathering had provided the government with detailed maps of my professional relationships, which they'd transformed into what they claimed was an organized criminal network. Rebecca was exactly the kind of attorney I needed: brilliant, aggressive, and experienced with high-profile federal cases. She'd successfully defended several white-collar clients against Department of Justice prosecutions, and her reputation for thorough preparation was legendary. But even she seemed sobered by the scope of the charges against me. "The government has clearly invested significant resources in this case," she noted, reviewing David's surveillance reports. "They have 2 years of detailed documentation about your activities, your relationships, and your business operations. We're not just fighting the evidence, we're fighting a narrative they've been building for years." The strategy Rebecca outlined was multifaceted. First, we'd challenge the methods used to gather evidence, particularly the extensive surveillance conducted through David's infiltration of my life. There are serious Fourth Amendment issues here, she explained. The level of intrusion into your private life, your family relationships, and your business operations may have crossed constitutional lines. Second, we'd present the legitimate business case for every transaction the government had flagged as suspicious. My company acquisitions followed clear, strategic logic, and my real estate investments were properly documented and transparently financed. We need to educate the jury about how legitimate business growth actually works, Rebecca said. The financial analysis would be crucial. Rebecca was bringing in forensic accountants who specialized in complex business transactions. They'd trace every dollar, document every source of income, and demonstrate that my wealth accumulation was entirely consistent with my legitimate business activities. The government's theory requires proving that you had undisclosed income sources, Rebecca explained, but your tax returns, business records, and financial statements tell a complete story of legal business success. We can account for every significant transaction. The human element would be equally important. Character witnesses who could testify about my business integrity, community involvement, and family values would help counteract the criminal enterprise narrative the government was promoting, but Rebecca was realistic about the challenges we faced. Juries tend to trust FBI agents, and David Chen will be their star witness. He spent 2 years in your inner circle, and his testimony will be detailed, personal, and convincing. We need to be prepared to challenge not just what he says, but his credibility and his methods. The timeline was aggressive. Federal prosecutors were pushing for a trial date within 6 months, claiming the evidence was straightforward and the case was ready for presentation. Rebecca planned to request additional time for discovery and preparation, but she warned that judges in federal court were often reluctant to grant lengthy delays. The media strategy was almost as important as the legal strategy. Public opinion could influence potential jurors, and the government had clearly been leaking selected information to financial journalists to support their narrative. Rebecca recommended hiring a crisis communications firm to help manage public perception of the case, but the most challenging aspect of our legal battle would be overcoming the betrayal narrative. David's testimony would be emotionally powerful because it was personal. He'd lived in our home, shared our meals, attended our family celebrations. His betrayal felt intimate and devastating, which could make his testimony about my alleged crimes more convincing to jurors. We need to flip that script, Rebecca explained. David's deception wasn't just professional, it was personal manipulation, designed to gather evidence for a predetermined conclusion. We need to show that his infiltration of your life was ethically questionable and potentially legally problematic. The financial cost of mounting this defense was staggering. Rebecca's retainer alone was $500,000, and she estimated total legal costs could reach $2 million before trial ended. With my assets frozen, paying for my defense meant liquidating everything I could access and borrowing against future earnings that might not exist if I were convicted. Most importantly, Rebecca emphasized that this wasn't just about avoiding conviction, it was about preserving my family's future. Even if we win at trial, your reputation and business relationships have been damaged. We need to not just prove your innocence, but demonstrate that this prosecution was fundamentally unjustified. As I left Rebecca's office that afternoon, walking past the FBI surveillance teams that now openly followed me everywhere, I realized that David's betrayal had launched a war I never wanted to fight. But with my family's future at stake, I had no choice but to fight it with everything I had. The financial transaction records that David had helped the FBI obtain read like a roadmap of my life, but interpreted through the lens of criminal suspicion. Every legitimate business deal, every strategic investment, every successful acquisition had been twisted into evidence of a criminal enterprise that existed only in the imagination of federal prosecutors. Rebecca's forensic accountants worked through the night, reconstructing the paper trail that David had systematically documented for 2 years. The sophistication of his intelligence gathering became clear as we reviewed hundreds of pages of financial analysis, business correspondence, and transaction summaries that he'd somehow obtained and transmitted to the FBI. "Look at this," Rebecca said, pointing to a detailed analysis of my Cloud Vault Technologies acquisition. David provided them with internal financial projections, confidential due diligence reports, and private communications between you and your legal team. This level of access goes far beyond what a security chief should have had. The Cloud Vault deal was typical of my acquisition strategy. Identify an underperforming technology company with solid fundamentals, negotiate a reasonable purchase price, and integrate their capabilities into my existing portfolio. I'd paid $12 million for a company with $18 million in annual revenue, but poor management and operational inefficiencies. But through David's reporting, the FBI had interpreted this straightforward business transaction as evidence of money laundering. They claimed the purchase price was artificially inflated to justify moving dirty money through legitimate business channels. The fact that Cloud Vault became profitable within 6 months of my acquisition was presented as evidence that I'd known something the market didn't, implying insider information or criminal connections. They don't understand how business actually works, Rebecca noted grimly. Your success in improving these companies is being used as evidence against you rather than proof of your legitimate business skills. The real estate investments were subjected to similar misinterpretation. My purchase of 3 Brooklyn warehouses in 2019 had been a strategic bet on neighborhood gentrification. I'd renovated the properties, attracted high-quality commercial tenants, and sold 2 of them at substantial profits within 18 months. David's intelligence reports revealed that I'd researched zoning changes, analyzed demographic trends, and consulted with local real estate professionals before making these investments. Normal due diligence for any serious real estate investor. But the FBI presented this research as evidence that I'd had advanced knowledge of development plans that weren't public information. They're suggesting you had corrupt relationships with city planning officials, Rebecca explained, based entirely on the fact that your investments turned out to be profitable. The banking relationships were particularly twisted. Patricia Wells, my investment banker for 5 years, had helped structure financing for several acquisitions and provided investment advice for my portfolio diversification. Her professional services were now being characterized as participation in a money laundering scheme. Patricia's detailed knowledge of my financial situation, documented through David's surveillance, was presented as evidence that she was helping me conceal the true sources of my wealth. The fact that she'd recommended specific investment strategies and helped optimize my tax obligations was interpreted as criminal conspiracy rather than professional financial services. Tony's business partnership with me became another thread in the government's conspiracy theory. Our joint ventures in technology acquisitions and real estate development were portrayed as a criminal enterprise rather than legitimate business collaborations. David had documented every conversation between Tony and me, every strategic decision we'd made together, every profit we'd shared from successful deals. The government's theory required believing that highly educated, successful professionals like Patricia and Tony had abandoned their legitimate careers to participate in criminal activities with someone they'd known for years. It required believing that I'd somehow convinced multiple accomplished individuals to risk their reputations and freedom for undefined criminal proceeds. Most troubling was the discovery of connections to other ongoing FBI investigations. Several people in my business network were now subjects of federal scrutiny, apparently triggered by their association with me as documented in David's reports. The investigation had metastasized beyond my case, creating a web of suspicion that threatened to ensnare anyone who'd done business with me. Rebecca's team identified at least 7 other individuals who were now facing federal investigation based partly on intelligence David had gathered about my business relationships. Some were clients who'd hired my companies for legitimate software solutions. Others were fellow investors who'd participated in real estate deals with me. All were now having their lives disrupted by association with someone the FBI had decided was probably guilty of something. This is how federal investigations spiral out of control, Rebecca observed. They start with suspicions about one person, then use surveillance to identify anyone connected to that person, then investigate those connections as potential co-conspirators. David's reporting didn't just target you, it created a target list of your entire professional network. The sophistication of David's operation became clear as we analyzed the timing and content of his intelligence reports. He'd been trained to identify specific types of information that would support money laundering charges, large cash transactions, international wire transfers, business relationships with foreign entities, and any financial activity that might suggest hidden income sources. But David had also been looking for evidence of other potential crimes. His reports included detailed observations about my relationships with government officials, my interactions with foreign business partners, and any activities that might suggest corruption, fraud, or tax evasion. The FBI hadn't just been building a money laundering case, they'd been fishing for any criminal activity they could potentially prove. The financial transaction records revealed the complete picture of how my trust in David had been weaponized against me. Every document I'd shared with him, every conversation he'd overheard, every business relationship he'd observed had been systematically documented and analyzed for criminal potential. 2 years of my financial life had been dissected by federal investigators who were determined to find evidence of crimes that simply didn't exist. Emma's diary entry was never meant to be evidence, but my legal team discovered it during preparation for potential character witness testimony. Rebecca read it aloud in her office, her voice softening as she shared my daughter's private thoughts about how her father's arrest had shattered her world. March 15th. I don't understand how this happened. Dad has always been the most honest person I know. He taught me that success comes from hard work and treating people fairly. Now, everyone at school whispers when I walk by, and Jessie's mom won't let her talk to me anymore. I feel like I'm living in someone else's nightmare. Reading Emma's words was more devastating than any federal charge could be. At 17, she was supposed to be worried about college applications, prom dates, and summer plans. Instead, she was grappling with the possibility that her father might be a criminal and her family's future might be destroyed. Sarah's transformation was equally heartbreaking. The confident, creative woman I'd married had become withdrawn and anxious, jumping at unexpected phone calls and constantly checking over her shoulder when leaving the house. The FBI surveillance had ended with my arrest, but the psychological damage lingered. "I keep thinking about what David saw," she confided. During one of our supervised phone conversations, every private conversation we had about our marriage, our dreams for Emma's future, our financial concerns when business was slow, he was taking notes. Marcus, he was probably reporting about our intimate moments, our family problems, everything we thought was private. The violation felt more personal than the financial charges I was facing. David hadn't just gathered evidence about my business activities, he'd invaded our family's emotional sanctuary. Every dinner conversation, every family movie night, every quiet moment between Sarah and me had been observed and analyzed by someone who was paid to betray our trust. Emma's college dreams were becoming casualties of the investigation. She'd been accepted to Northwestern University with a partial academic scholarship, but the remaining tuition costs were now impossible with our frozen assets. The girl who'd planned to study international business was now researching community colleges and part-time job opportunities. "I used to be proud to tell people my dad was a successful entrepreneur," Emma wrote in another diary entry. "Now I'm embarrassed to admit who my father is. My guidance counselor asked if I wanted to use my mother's maiden name on college applications to avoid complications. I never imagined my last name would become something to hide from." The social isolation was crushing all of us. Our country club membership had been suspended, effectively ending Sarah's access to the professional network that had sustained her interior design business. The charity boards where I'd served asked for my resignation, eliminating another important social connection for our family. Emma's soccer team dynamics became unbearable. Parents who'd cheered for her during games now avoided eye contact during pickup. The team carpool arrangements that had made transportation easier suddenly didn't include Emma anymore. Eventually, she quit the team she'd played on since middle school rather than endure the daily awkwardness. Sarah's book club, which had met monthly at our penthouse for 3 years, quietly relocated their meetings without explanation. Women, who'd been her friends for years, suddenly had scheduling conflicts that prevented social gatherings. The isolation was systematic and thorough. The financial stress created additional family tensions. Sarah's parents had offered to help with basic living expenses, but accepting charity from her family felt like admitting defeat. Emma took a part-time job at a local coffee shop, something she'd never needed to do before, to help with her personal expenses and contribute to the household. Most painful was watching Emma's relationships with extended family become strained. My brother Michael, worried about his own business reputation, limited his contact with us. Sarah's sister, married to a federal government employee, was advised by her husband to maintain distance until the legal issues were resolved. "I feel like I'm watching our entire life disappear," Sarah told me during one particularly difficult conversation. "It's not just the money or the legal problems. It's everything we've built together, our friendships, our community, our sense of security. David didn't just betray you, Marcus, he destroyed our family's foundation." Emma's academic performance, which had always been exceptional, began suffering as the stress mounted. Her senior year grades, crucial for college applications, dropped significantly. Teachers who'd known her since freshman year were understanding but couldn't shield her from the constant whispers and speculation among classmates. The therapy sessions that Rebecca recommended for family counseling revealed the depth of trauma David's deception had caused. Emma struggled with trust issues that extended far beyond our family situation. If Dad couldn't tell that David was lying, she asked the counselor, how can any of us ever trust anyone again? Sarah's sleep patterns were completely disrupted. She'd lie awake at night, replaying conversations with David, trying to identify signs of deception she'd missed. The man who'd seemed genuinely concerned about our family's safety had been documenting our vulnerabilities for federal prosecutors. The community support we'd expected from years of charitable giving and local involvement never materialized. Instead, we discovered how quickly success can turn into suspicion, how rapidly admiration can become fear of association. People we'd considered friends revealed that their loyalty was conditional on our continued prosperity and untarnished reputation. Emma's diary captured the emotional reality we were all experiencing. "I used to think our family was strong enough to handle anything. Now, I realize that strength was built on trust, and trust is exactly what was taken from us." David didn't just lie to Dad, he taught all of us that the people closest to us might be pretending to care while secretly working to hurt us. The human cost of David's betrayal extended far beyond legal fees and frozen assets. It had fundamentally altered our family's ability to trust, to form relationships, and to feel secure in our own home. The private investigator Rebecca hired was nothing like David. Where David had been smooth and personable, Jake Morrison was blunt and methodical. Where David had integrated himself into our lives, Jake maintained professional distance. Most importantly, where David had been building a case against me, Jake was committed to uncovering the truth. Your boy David Chen isn't his real name, Jake announced during our first meeting. His actual name is David Chen, and he's been working undercover operations for the FBI for 8 years. This wasn't his first long-term infiltration. Jake spread David's real personnel file across Rebecca's conference table. The document revealed a career built on deception and manipulation. David had spent 2 years embedded in a Miami investment firm, gathering evidence for a securities fraud case. Before that, he'd infiltrated a Los Angeles real estate development company suspected of money laundering. My case was just the latest in a series of long-term undercover operations. He's what they call a deep cover specialist, Jake explained. These agents are trained to build genuine emotional connections with their targets while maintaining psychological distance from the relationships they're exploiting. It's sophisticated psychological manipulation. The training records were particularly disturbing. David had completed courses in advanced social engineering, long-term identity maintenance, and emotional manipulation for intelligence gathering. He'd been specifically educated in techniques for building trust, extracting information, and maintaining cover identities for extended periods. Look at his psychological profile, Jake said, pointing to assessment documents. He scores extremely high on measures of emotional detachment and deception capability. The FBI specifically recruits agents who can form fake relationships without experiencing guilt or attachment. David's previous operations revealed a pattern of targeting successful entrepreneurs who'd experienced rapid business growth, the Miami investment firm, the Los Angeles development company, and now my business empire involved wealthy individuals whose success had attracted federal attention. There's a profile they work from, Jake explained. Self-made entrepreneurs, rapid wealth accumulation, complex business structures, international connections. You fit their template perfectly. Most disturbing was the discovery that David's infiltration methods were standardized. The security consulting approach, the gradual integration into family life, the systematic intelligence gathering, all were techniques he'd refined through previous operations. The Miami case file showed identical patterns. David had approached the investment firm claiming specialized expertise in financial security. He'd gradually gained access to sensitive business information, attended family gatherings, and built personal relationships with his targets. The firm's CEO had trusted David enough to make him godfather to his youngest child. That CEO is now serving 12 years in federal prison, Jake noted grimly. His family lost everything, and his children still don't understand why someone they considered an uncle destroyed their father's life. The Los Angeles case was equally devastating. David had spent 18 months embedded in the real estate company, attending weddings, holiday celebrations, and business retreats. He'd been present during the birth of the company founder's daughter, and had provided emotional support during the founder's father's cancer treatment. The founder committed suicide 6 months after conviction, Jake revealed. His wife found a note saying he couldn't live with the betrayal, that David's deception had destroyed his ability to trust anyone. Reading about David's previous victims, I realized that our family's experience wasn't unique. The psychological manipulation, the violation of intimate family moments, the systematic documentation of private lives, these were refined techniques that David had perfected through years of practice. Jake's investigation revealed that David's cover identities were supported by an extensive FBI infrastructure. The military records were fabricated but professionally created. The client references were either cooperating witnesses or FBI personnel posing as former employers. Even his apartment, lease, and credit history were government manufactured to support his assumed identity. The resources invested in these operations are enormous, Jake explained. They create complete false identities, maintain them for years, and provide ongoing support for agents in the field. Your case probably cost taxpayers over $2 million before they even filed charges. But Jake's most significant discovery was evidence that David's operation might have violated federal guidelines for undercover investigations. The extent of surveillance, the invasion of family privacy, and the duration of the operation potentially exceeded what was legally permissible. There are strict rules about how long agents can maintain undercover roles and what kinds of relationships they can develop, Jake explained. David's integration into your family life, particularly his relationships with your wife and daughter, may have crossed ethical and legal boundaries. The psychological evaluation reports in David's file revealed the personal cost of his work. Multiple assessments noted emotional detachment, difficulty maintaining authentic relationships, and signs of compassion fatigue. David had been scheduled for psychological counseling twice during his previous operations. These deep cover operations destroy the agents almost as much as the targets, Jake observed. David has spent 8 years of his life lying to people who trusted him, attending funerals of people he helped convict, building relationships he knew he'd eventually betray. Most importantly, Jake discovered that David's current assignment was supposed to have ended 6 months earlier. The FBI had extended the operation multiple times, apparently fishing for additional evidence beyond their original mandate. This extension might provide grounds for challenging the entire investigation. They kept him in place longer than authorized, Jake explained, which suggests they didn't find what they expected to find initially. That's good for your case. Implies the evidence they gathered early on wasn't sufficient to support their theories. The personnel file also revealed that David had requested transfer from Undercover work twice in the past 2 years. His supervisors had denied both requests, noting that his exceptional performance made him too valuable for reassignment. Reading between the lines of David's psychological evaluations, I realized that the man who'd destroyed my family's sense of security was himself struggling with the psychological cost of his deceptions. The betrayal that had devastated us had also damaged the person who'd perpetrated it. But understanding David's internal conflicts didn't diminish the harm he'd caused. If anything, it made his actions more troubling. He'd continued manipulating our family, even while knowing the psychological cost of his deceptions. The civil lawsuit filing against the FBI was our declaration of war. Rebecca's legal team had spent weeks preparing a comprehensive challenge to the methods used in my investigation, and the document we submitted to federal court was a devastating critique of Operation Golden Gate, United States District Court, Southern District of New York. The filing began. Marcus Kane versus Federal Bureau of Investigation, ETHL. Civil rights violation and unlawful surveillance complaint. Our primary argument centered on the Fourth Amendment violations inherent in David's infiltration of my family life. The extensive surveillance of our private conversations, family gatherings, and intimate moments went far beyond what was necessary for a financial crimes investigation. The defendants conducted a systematic invasion of plaintiff's privacy that violated clearly established constitutional rights. Rebecca had written, Agent Chang's infiltration of plaintiff's family relationships, documentation of private family moments, and surveillance of protected communications exceeded the scope of any legitimate law enforcement purpose. The lawsuit detailed specific instances where David's surveillance had crossed constitutional boundaries. The documentation of Emma's college application process, Sarah's private conversations with friends, and our family's holiday celebrations served no legitimate investigative purpose, but violated our reasonable expectation of privacy. We challenged the duration of the operation as excessive and unjustified. 18 months of surveillance without finding evidence of criminal activity should have ended the investigation. Instead, the FBI had extended David's assignment repeatedly, apparently hoping to eventually find something incriminating. The investigation became a fishing expedition, Rebecca argued in her supporting brief. When initial surveillance failed to produce evidence of criminal activity, defendants expanded their operation rather than concluding that their suspicions were unfounded. Our legal strategy also attacked the predicate for the investigation. The rapid business growth that had triggered federal interest was entirely consistent with legitimate entrepreneurial success. The FBI had no reasonable basis for suspecting criminal activity beyond my financial success, which was not grounds for the extensive surveillance they'd conducted. The public relations aspect of our counterattack was equally important. Rebecca had hired Morrison Communications, a crisis management firm specializing in white-collar defense cases. Their strategy was to reframe the narrative. From successful businessmen under investigation to innocent family victimized by government overreach, the FBI spent 2 years and millions of taxpayer dollars investigating a legitimate businessman whose only crime was being too successful too quickly. Our press release stated, this case represents a dangerous precedent where financial success becomes grounds for extensive government surveillance. The media strategy was working. Financial publications that had initially covered my arrests with suspicion were now questioning the FBI's methods. The Wall Street Journal ran an editorial titled When Success Becomes Suspicious, criticizing the government's tendency to investigate rapid wealth accumulation without evidence of criminal activity. Business Week featured a cover story on government overreach in financial investigations, using my case as a primary example of how federal agencies were targeting successful entrepreneurs based on flawed assumptions about legitimate business growth. We organized a legal defense fund that attracted support from other business owners who worried about similar government targeting. Within 2 weeks, we'd raised $400,000 from entrepreneurs who saw my case as a threat to all successful business people. The congressional angle was particularly effective. Rebecca arranged meetings with representatives who served on oversight committees with jurisdiction over FBI operations. Several congressmen expressed concern about the resources devoted to investigating someone without clear evidence of criminal activity. Representative James Sullivan, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Surveillance Oversight, agreed to request briefings about Operation Golden Gate. His public statements questioned whether the FBI was properly prioritizing its investigative resources. When federal agents spend 2 years infiltrating a family's private life based on suspicions about rapid business growth, Sullivan stated, we need to examine whether our law enforcement priorities are appropriately calibrated. The academic legal community also rallied to our cause. Law professors at Columbia and NYU filed amicus briefs supporting our constitutional challenges. Their analysis focused on the implications of long-term undercover operations for Fourth Amendment protections. Professor Elizabeth Warren, at Columbia Law School, wrote an influential law review article titled The Domestic Surveillance State, When Undercover Operations Become Unlawful Invasions of Privacy. She used my case as a primary example of how modern surveillance techniques were outpacing constitutional protections. But our most powerful weapon was the human story. Sarah agreed to give a limited number of interviews describing how David's deception had affected our family. Her account of discovering that someone she'd trusted with her family's safety had been building a case against her husband was emotionally compelling. For 2 years, I shared my hopes, fears, and dreams with someone I thought cared about our family, Sarah told 60 Minutes. I talked to David about my concerns for Emma's future, my worries about Marcus working too hard, my pride in our success. Every conversation was a lie designed to gather evidence against the man I love. Emma's story was equally powerful. The 17-year-old who'd trusted David enough to ask for advice about college applications and career choices had been betrayed by someone she'd considered a family friend. The pressure campaign was having an effect. FBI sources began leaking too friendly. Journalists that the investigation had been more complex and resource-intensive than initially justified. Someone within the Bureau was apparently concerned about the precedent the case was setting. Justice Department officials started signaling willingness to consider plea negotiations that would resolve the case without the extensive trial that our civil lawsuit was publicizing. Our counterattack was forcing them to weigh the cost of continuing prosecution against the risk of exposing their methods to broader public scrutiny. The civil lawsuit discovery process would eventually require the FBI to produce internal documents about their decision-making process, the scope of their surveillance, and the justification for extending David's operation. Government lawyers were clearly concerned about what those documents might reveal. Most importantly, our counterattack was shifting the narrative from my alleged crimes to the government's questionable methods. The conversation was no longer about whether I was guilty, but about whether the FBI had violated constitutional rights in their investigation. The civil lawsuit filing was more than legal strategy. It was a declaration that we wouldn't accept victimization quietly, that we'd fight the government's overreach with the same determination they'd used to investigate us. The recorded confession was actually a deposition, but David's words felt like a confession nonetheless. Sitting in the federal courthouse conference room, watching the man who'd betrayed my family answer questions under oath, I finally heard him speak honestly about what he'd done to us. State your real name for the record, Rebecca began. David Allen Chang, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. Hearing his actual name spoken aloud was jarring. For 2 years, he'd been David Chen, Head of Security, Family Friend, Trusted Advisor. David Chang was a stranger who'd stolen those roles to build a case against me. Agent Chang, how long did you maintain your undercover identity in the Kane household? 26 months, from March 2022 through May 2024. During that time, did you attend family gatherings, private conversations, and intimate family moments? David's pause was long enough to suggest internal conflict. Yes, I attended numerous family events as part of maintaining my cover identity. Rebecca pressed harder. Did you attend Emma Kane's 17th birthday party? Yes. Did you help her blow out the candles and participate in family celebrations, while secretly documenting the guests and conversations for federal investigators? That's correct. I watched David's face during these exchanges. The confident, personable man who'd shared coffee with me every morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely troubled by the questions he was being forced to answer. Agent Chang, did you develop personal relationships with members of the Kane family beyond what was necessary for your investigation? The nature of long-term undercover work requires building authentic-seeming relationships to maintain cover credibility. That's not what I asked. Did you personally care about the Kane family members you were deceiving? David's attorney objected, but Rebecca had made her point. The question hung in the air, and David's expression suggested it was one he'd been asking himself. Agent Chang, were there moments during your assignment when you questioned the ethics of your role in the Kane family's life? I followed FBI protocols for undercover operations. That's not what I asked. Did you personally struggle with deceiving people who trusted you? Another long pause. Long-term undercover work involves psychological challenges. Rebecca introduced evidence about David's requests for transfer from undercover work. Agent Chang, did you twice request reassignment from undercover operations during your time with the Kane family? Yes. Were those requests denied? Yes. Were you told that your exceptional performance made you too valuable for reassignment? That was part of the reasoning. Yes? The most devastating moment came when Rebecca asked about specific family interactions. Agent Chang, do you recall a conversation with Sarah Kane about her concerns regarding her husband's work-life balance? I recall many conversations with Mrs. Kane. This specific conversation occurred last November. Mrs. Kane expressed worry that her husband was working too many hours and asked your advice about encouraging him to take more family time. Do you remember your response? David's discomfort was visible. I don't recall the specific conversation. Let me refresh your memory with your own surveillance report. Rebecca Reed from FBI documents. Mrs. Kane expressed concerns about subject's work schedule and its impact on family relationships. I provided reassurance and suggested she encourage subject to take upcoming holidays off to spend time with family. This approach would provide additional opportunities for surveillance during relaxed, private family interactions. The room fell silent. David had used Sarah's genuine concern for our marriage as an opportunity to gather more intelligence about our private life. Agent Chang, were you trained in psychological manipulation techniques for long-term undercover operations? We received training in social integration methods. Were you specifically trained to exploit emotional vulnerabilities to gather intelligence? We're trained to build rapport and maintain cover credibility. Rebecca produced David's training records. Did you complete courses titled Advanced Social Engineering and Emotional Manipulation for Intelligence Gathering? Yes. The most painful revelation came when Rebecca asked about Emma's relationship with David. Agent Chang, did Emma Kane ask you for advice about college applications and career choices? She may have asked for general guidance. Did you provide advice while knowing that you were gathering intelligence about her family's financial planning and educational priorities? David's voice was barely audible. I provided appropriate responses to maintain cover. Agent Chang, did Emma Kane trust you enough to confide in you about personal problems and family concerns? She talked to me sometimes? Yes. Did you document those conversations in your surveillance reports? I documented relevant information. Yes. Was a 17-year-old girl's personal struggles relevant to your money laundering investigation? David's attorney objected again, but the damage was done. Everyone in the room understood that David had exploited a teenager's trust to gather intelligence about her family. The deposition revealed that David himself had been damaged by his undercover work. His requests for transfer, his psychological evaluations, noting compassion fatigue, and his visible discomfort during questioning all suggested that maintaining our deception had taken a personal toll. But understanding David's internal conflict didn't excuse what he'd done to my family. If anything, it made his actions more troubling. He'd continued manipulating people he'd grown to care about, even while knowing the psychological cost of his deceptions. Agent Chang, Rebecca concluded, do you believe the Kane family trusted you? Yes. Do you believe that trust was justified? David looked directly at me for the first time during the deposition. No, he said quietly. It wasn't. That single word carried the weight of 2 years of betrayal. David Chang had finally told the truth about what he'd done to us. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan looked like a fortress on the morning jury selection began. Media vans lined the street, protesters held signs supporting government accountability, and FBI agents maintained visible security around the building. 2.5 years after David's infiltration of my life began, the legal battle that would determine my future was finally starting. The People versus Marcus Kane, Judge Patricia Harrison announced as we entered the courtroom. The formality of the moment struck me after months of preparation, depositions, and legal maneuvering. Everything would now be decided by 12 strangers who knew nothing about my life beyond what they'd read in newspaper headlines. The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chuno, relation to David despite the surname, coincidence that seemed almost cruel. Chen was a veteran financial crimes prosecutor with a reputation for methodical preparation and compelling courtroom presence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began, over the next several weeks, you will hear about a sophisticated money laundering operation disguised as legitimate business success. The defendant, Marcus Kane, used a complex network of companies and associates to wash proceeds from criminal activities through apparently legal business transactions. Chen's narrative was compelling because it was built on David's intelligence gathering. Every business deal I'd made, every acquisition I'd completed, every investment decision I'd pursued had been documented in excruciating detail. The prosecution could present my legitimate business activities as criminal because they had insider knowledge of my decision-making processes. The evidence will show that Mr. Kane's rapid accumulation of wealth was inconsistent with his reported income sources. Chen continued, you will hear testimony from FBI Special Agent David Chang, who spent over 2 years embedded in the defendant's organization, documenting suspicious financial activities and criminal associations. The phrase criminal associations stung because it referred to relationships with people like Tony Salvatore and Patricia Wells, respected professionals whose only crime was doing business with me. David's intelligence had provided the government with detailed maps of my business network, which they'd transformed into what they claimed was a criminal conspiracy. Rebecca's opening statement was powerful, but faced the challenge of overcoming 2 years of documented surveillance. She focused on the legitimate nature of my business success and the questionable methods used to investigate me. Marcus Kane is guilty of one thing: being too successful too quickly, Rebecca told the jury. The government became suspicious of rapid business growth and wealth accumulation that was entirely consistent with entrepreneurial success. Rather than investigating actual evidence of criminal activity, they infiltrated Mr. Kane's family life, violated his privacy, and twisted legitimate business transactions into a criminal conspiracy that exists only in their imagination. Rebecca's strategy was to humanize our family's experience while demonstrating the legitimate nature of my business activities. She promised to show that every transaction the government characterized as suspicious had clear business justification and proper documentation. The evidence will show that Agent Chang didn't just investigate Mr. Kane's business activities, Rebecca explained. He infiltrated the Kane family's private life, attended their daughter's birthday parties, shared their holiday celebrations, and violated their most intimate family moments to gather intelligence for a case built on suspicion rather than evidence. The jury selection process had taken 3 days and revealed the challenge we faced. Most potential jurors had heard about the case through media coverage that emphasized my wealth and the federal investigation. Finding 12 people without preconceived notions about wealthy defendants or FBI investigations was nearly impossible. The selected jury included a retired teacher, 2 small business owners, a nurse, an accountant, a construction worker, 3 corporate employees, a social worker, a graduate student, and a retiree. Rebecca felt optimistic about the small business owners and the accountant, believing they'd understand legitimate business growth patterns. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury emphasized the presumption of innocence and the government's burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But I could see in some jurors' faces the assumption that wealthy defendants charged with financial crimes were probably guilty of something. The media circus outside the courthouse was intense. Financial news networks provided live coverage of opening statements. Legal analysts debated the strength of the government's case, and business publications speculated about the implications for other successful entrepreneurs. Sarah attended every day of jury selection and opening statements, sitting directly behind me in the courtroom's front row. Her presence was both comforting and heartbreaking. I knew how difficult it was for her to relive David's betrayal through public testimony. Emma had chosen not to attend the trial, focusing instead on her senior year of high school and college preparation, but I knew she was following every development through news coverage and family conversations. The trial wasn't just about my legal fatute, it was about whether our family's story would have a hopeful ending. The prosecution's first witness would be FBI Special Agent David Chen, and Rebecca had spent weeks preparing for cross-examination that would expose the ethical problems with his infiltration of our family life. As court adjourned after opening statements, I realized that the next phase of our legal battle would be the most challenging. David would testify about 2 years of intimate knowledge about my business activities and personal life, and Rebecca would have to discredit someone who'd been remarkably effective at building trust and gathering intelligence. The trial would ultimately determine not just my legal fate, but whether David's betrayal would succeed in destroying everything I'd worked to build. David's testimony lasted 3 days, and watching him recount 2 years of our family's life from the witness stand was surreal. The man who'd shared coffee with me every morning, attended Emma's soccer games, and provided comfort during family crises was now methodically describing how he'd documented our private moments for federal prosecutors. Agent Chang, Prosecutor Michael Chen began. Please describe your observations of the defendant's business practices during your undercover assignment. David's voice was steady, professional, completely different from the warm tone he'd used during our morning conversations. I observed multiple instances where Mr. Kane engaged in suspicious financial activities, consistent with money laundering operations. He detailed business meetings I'd considered routine, describing legitimate negotiations as criminal conspiracies. My acquisition of Cloud Vault Technologies, which had been a straightforward business deal, was presented as evidence of money laundering because David claimed the purchase price was artificially inflated to justify moving dirty money. The defendant paid $12 million for a company with assets valued at approximately $8 million, David testified. This overpayment created an avenue for laundering proceeds from undisclosed criminal activities. What David didn't mention, what the prosecution conveniently ignored, was that Cloud Vault's value wasn't just in its assets, but in its technology, client relationships, and growth potential. Within 6 months of my acquisition, the company was generating profits that more than justified the purchase price. Rebecca's cross-examination was devastating. She forced David to acknowledge the extensive training he'd received in manipulation and the specific techniques he'd used to build trust with our family. Agent Chang, you testified that you observed suspicious financial activities. But you also testified that you provided Mr. Kane with advice about those same financial decisions, correct? I occasionally offered input when asked. In fact, you didn't just offer input, you actively encouraged some of the very transactions you now characterize as criminal, didn't you? David's discomfort was visible. I provided responses consistent with maintaining my cover identity. Rebecca produced FBI surveillance reports showing that David had indeed encouraged several business decisions. He was now characterizing as evidence of criminal activity. His role hadn't been passive observation, he'd actively participated in shaping the business activities. He was condemning. The expert witness testimony was crucial for our defense. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a forensic accountant who'd analyzed thousands of business transactions for federal courts, reviewed every deal the government had flagged as suspicious. Based on my analysis of Mr. Kane's financial records, business documentation, and transaction patterns, Dr. Reynolds testified, his wealth accumulation is entirely consistent with legitimate entrepreneurial success. Every significant transaction has clear business justification and proper documentation. Dr. Reynolds had traced every dollar of my income to legitimate sources. My business growth followed predictable patterns for successful tech acquisitions. My real estate investments were based on market research and strategic planning, not insider information or criminal proceeds. In 30 years of forensic accounting, Dr. Reynolds explained, I've analyzed hundreds of actual money laundering operations. Mr. Kane's business activities display none of the characteristics typical of criminal financial schemes. The government's case began unraveling when Rebecca introduced evidence about the FBI's investigation methods. Internal bureau documents, obtained through our civil lawsuit discovery, revealed that agents had doubted the strength of their case multiple times but had been pressured to continue the investigation. Agent Morrison, Rebecca asked an FBI supervisor, did you recommend ending the Kane investigation in October 2023 due to lack of evidence? I expressed concerns about resource allocation. Yes. Did you write in an internal memo that continued, surveillance has failed to produce evidence of criminal activity consistent with initial suspicions? I may have written something to that effect. The memo Rebecca introduced showed that multiple FBI agents had questioned whether the investigation was justified. David's operation had been extended repeatedly, despite concerns that they weren't. Finding evidence of actual criminal behavior, the psychological testimony was particularly powerful. Dr. Sarah Martinez, an expert in undercover operations and their psychological effects, explained how David's infiltration of our family life had crossed ethical boundaries. Long-term undercover operations create complex psychological dynamics. Dr. Martinez testified, when agents develop genuine emotional connections with their targets, it becomes difficult to maintain objectivity about criminal behavior versus legitimate activities. Dr. Martinez had reviewed David's psychological evaluations and surveillance reports. Her analysis suggested that his extended infiltration of our family life had compromised his ability to distinguish between suspicious activities and normal family behavior. Agent Cheng's reports increasingly focused on personal family dynamics rather than business activities. Dr. Martinez explained, this suggests that the operation had evolved beyond its legitimate investigative purpose into inappropriate surveillance of private family life. The turning point came when Rebecca introduced evidence about David's previous undercover operations. The jury learned about the Miami investment firm CEO who'd committed suicide after conviction, the Los Angeles developer whose family had been destroyed by David's deception, and the pattern of psychological manipulation David had refined through years of practice. Agent Cheng, Rebecca asked during recall testimony, how many of your previous undercover targets have maintained their businesses and family relationships after federal prosecution? I don't have specific statistics on that. To your knowledge, has any family you've infiltrated recovered from the psychological damage of discovering your deception? David's attorney objected, but the question had achieved its purpose. The jury could see that David's operations didn't just gather evidence, they destroyed families and lives. The defense's character witnesses were compelling. Business partners, employees, and community leaders testified about my integrity, charitable giving, and legitimate business practices. Emma's high school principal described my involvement in educational initiatives and scholarship programs. Mr. Kane has donated over $200,000 to our school's technology programs, Principal Roberts testified. His support has directly benefited hundreds of students who couldn't otherwise afford advanced computer science education. Sarah's testimony was emotionally powerful. She described David's integration into our family life and the devastating impact of discovering his deception. He wasn't just gathering evidence about business transactions. Sarah explained to the jury he was documenting our most private family moments, our hopes and fears, our love for each other. When I discovered he'd been lying about everything, it felt like our entire family history had been violated. The prosecution's case was weakening. but they still had David's detailed surveillance records and his compelling personal testimony about observing my business activities. The government's strategy was to overwhelm the jury with the volume of suspicious activities David had documented, even if individual transactions could be explained. But Rebecca's systematic destruction of David's credibility was having an effect. By the end of his testimony, David appeared less like a heroic federal agent and more like someone who'd violated a family's trust for professional advancement. The expert testimony on FBI investigative procedures was damning. Former agents testified that David's operation had exceeded normal parameters for undercover investigations and that the personal surveillance of my family had violated Bureau guidelines. As the defense case concluded, I felt cautiously optimistic. We'd demonstrated that my business success was legitimate, that David's investigation methods were questionable, and that the government's case was built on suspicion rather than evidence of actual criminal activity. The jury deliberated for 18 hours over 3 days. 18 hours to determine whether 2 years of David's deception would succeed in destroying my life, whether the government's suspicions about rapid business success would be validated, whether my family's trust had been betrayed for a legitimate purpose. Sarah sat beside me in the courtroom as we waited for the verdict, her hand gripping mine with the same intensity she'd shown during Emma's birth 17 years earlier. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Harrison asked when the 12 jurors filed back into the courtroom. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied. The next 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Every sound in the courtroom seemed amplified: rustle of papers, the creak of chairs, the subtle breathing of 50 people waiting to learn my fate. On the charge of conspiracy to commit money laundering, we find the defendant not guilty. Relief flooded through me, but I forced myself to remain still. There were 15 more charges to hear. On the charge of tax evasion, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, we find the defendant not guilty. Each not guilty verdict felt like vindication not just of my innocence, but of everything Rebecca had argued about the government's flawed investigation and David's questionable methods. When the foreman finished reading all 16 not guilty verdicts, the courtroom erupted. Sarah was crying. Rebecca was smiling, and I felt a combination of relief and exhaustion that was overwhelming. But the celebration was tempered by the realization of what we'd lost. The trial had vindicated my legal innocence, but it couldn't restore the trust David had violated or repair the relationships his deception had damaged. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca addressed the media while I stood with Sarah and Emma, who'd skipped school to hear the verdict. "Today's unanimous not guilty verdicts confirm what we've maintained from the beginning," Rebecca announced. "Marcus Kane is an innocent man whose only crime was being too successful too quickly." The questions from reporters were predictable, but painful. "Mr. Kane, how do you feel about Agent Cheng's deception? Will you pursue civil litigation against the FBI?" I kept my responses brief and focused on moving forward. "My family has been through an ordeal that no American family should have to endure," I said. "We're grateful for the jury's recognition of the truth. But rebuilding was complicated. The business relationships that had been damaged by the investigation didn't automatically repair themselves because of the not guilty verdicts. Some clients remained nervous about association with someone who'd been under federal investigation. Tony Salvatore gradually resumed our business partnership, though the easy trust we'd enjoyed for 8 years had been complicated by the stress of the investigation and the discovery that our private conversations had been documented by federal agents. The frozen assets were released within 2 weeks of the verdict, but the financial damage was substantial. Legal fees had consumed over $1.8 million, and business opportunities lost during the investigation were worth significantly more. The civil lawsuit against the FBI moved forward with new momentum after the criminal trial vindication. Rebecca was confident that the not guilty verdicts strengthened our constitutional claims, but the most lasting damage was psychological. Sarah struggled with trusting new people in our lives, constantly wondering if their friendliness was genuine or professionally motivated. Emma was more guarded in her relationships, having learned that people she trusted could be harboring secret agendas. 6 months after the verdict, we received news that David Chen had requested transfer from the FBI's Undercover division. According to sources Rebecca maintained within the Bureau, David's psychological evaluations after my trial had raised concerns about his continued effectiveness. The Department of Justice quietly implemented new guidelines for long-term undercover operations, specifically addressing the infiltration of family relationships. My case had apparently highlighted problems that needed correction. Most importantly, our family gradually healed. The trust between Sarah, Emma, and me remained strong because it had been built on genuine love and shared experiences rather than professional deception. The verdict had vindicated my legal innocence, but recovery from David's betrayal would be a longer process that extended far beyond any courtroom decision. 2 years after the verdict, I signed a contract with a new security company, though the irony wasn't lost on me. The document represented both my continued need for protection and my cautious return to trusting others with my family's safety. Elite Protection Services was different from the firm that had sent David into our lives. Their approach emphasized transparency, multiple points of contact, and regular rotation of personnel to prevent the kind of deep personal integration that had made David's deception so effective. Mr. Kane, the company president, assured me during our initial meeting, our protocols specifically prevent any single agent from developing extensive personal relationships with client families. We've actually studied your case as an example of what can go wrong when professional boundaries are violated. The new security arrangements were more formal, less personal, but also less vulnerable to the kind of infiltration we'd experienced. The agents who protected our family maintained professional distance, which felt safer even if it was less comfortable than the friendship we'd believed we shared with David. My business empire had not only survived the federal investigation, but I actually grown stronger. The public vindication had attracted clients who valued working with someone who'd withstood government scrutiny and emerged vindicated. My companies were now worth over $120 million. A significant increase from the $85 million valuation when I was arrested. The Cloud Vault Technologies acquisition that the government had characterized as money laundering had become one of my most successful investments. The company's revenue had doubled under my ownership, validating the business judgment that federal prosecutors had questioned. Emma graduated from Northwestern University with honors, having completed her degree in international business despite the disruption of her senior year of high school. The girl who'd once worried about hiding her family name had written her senior thesis on the psychological effects of federal investigations on families, turning our traumatic experience into academic insight. Dad, she told me during her graduation dinner, what happened with David taught me something important about resilience. Our family survived something that could have destroyed us because we had genuine love and trust to build on. David's lies couldn't change that foundation. Sarah's interior design business had flourished in the years following the trial. Clients were initially attracted by curiosity about our high-profile case, but they stayed because of her exceptional talent and the depth that our family's ordeal had added to her work. Going through that experience taught me something about creating spaces where people feel truly safe. Sarah explained to a magazine interviewing her about her design philosophy. Security isn't just about locks and cameras, it's about creating environments where authentic relationships can flourish. The civil lawsuit against the FBI had been settled for $3.2 million. A substantial vindication, though, not enough to compensate for the psychological damage David's operation had caused. More importantly, the settlement had included commitments to revise bureau policies on long-term undercover operations and family infiltration. David Chen had indeed transferred from undercover work and was now assigned to financial crimes analysis, a desk job that didn't require deceiving anyone. According to reports Rebecca occasionally received, he'd undergone extensive counseling to address the psychological effects of years spent maintaining false identities and betraying people who'd trusted him. Learning about David's struggles with his undercover career didn't provide satisfaction, but it did offer perspective. The FBI's methods had damaged everyone involved, not just our family, but also the agent who'd been trained to manipulate our emotions and document our private lives. The community relationships that had been damaged during the investigation had largely been repaired, though some remained forever changed. Friends who distanced themselves during the legal proceedings had gradually returned, but the experience had taught us to value the people who'd remained loyal during our most difficult period. Tony Salvatore and I had resumed our business partnership, though our relationship now included protocols for protecting sensitive communications and more formal documentation of our business decisions. The easy trust of our early partnership had been replaced by procedures designed to prevent misunderstandings that could be misinterpreted by future investigators. Most importantly, our family had developed a more nuanced understanding of trust and relationships. We'd learned to be cautious without becoming cynical, to protect ourselves without isolating ourselves, and to value genuine connections while recognizing that not everyone who seems friendly has honest intentions. The penthouse where David had shared so many family meals and documented our private moments had been completely renovated. Sarah's design had eliminated the spaces where we'd felt most violated by his surveillance, creating new areas where our family could build memories that weren't tainted by his deception. I needed to reclaim our home. Sarah explained about the renovation. Every room where David had stood and lied to us needed to be transformed into something new, something that belonged completely to our family. The experience had taught me that wealth and success, while providing security and opportunity, also attracted attention that wasn't always welcome. The rapid business growth that I'd been proud of had triggered suspicions that led to years of investigation and personal violation. But I'd also learned that the American legal system, despite its flaws, had ultimately protected me from government overreach. The jury that heard our case had seen through the prosecution's theory and recognized that legitimate business success wasn't evidence of criminal activity. Emma often asked me if I regretted the choices that had led to David's infiltration of our lives. Would I have preferred slower business growth that might not have attracted federal attention? Would I choose different business strategies to avoid suspicion? No, I told her honestly. Success shouldn't be something to apologize for or hide from. What happened to our family was wrong, but it wasn't caused by anything we did. It was caused by someone who is trained to betray trust and by investigators who assumed guilt instead of proving it. The new security company contract in my hands represented more than protection. It symbolized our family's determination to continue living fully despite what we'd experienced. We would be more careful, more aware, more protective of our privacy, but we wouldn't allow David's betrayal to prevent us from pursuing our dreams or building relationships with people who deserved our trust. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that David's greatest failure wasn't just betraying our trust, it was underestimating our family's ability to survive and recover from his deception. We were stronger now than we'd been before he entered our lives, not because of what he'd done to us, but because of how we'd chosen to respond to it. The morning coffee routine that David had once shared with me had been replaced by family breakfast. Conversations where Sarah, Emma, and I planned our days together. Real relationships had replaced the false one that had nearly destroyed us. That was the most important lesson David's betrayal had taught us. Authentic love and trust, built on truth and genuine care, were stronger than any deception designed to tear them apart.